we were just talking, I guess this is the green room out there, we were just talking about how everybody's excited about the opportunities in Cuba, and we don't mean to be, but we might come off like the wet blanket on that optimism, if you will. My name is Glenn Ware. I'm the partner in charge of our strategic threat practice at PwC. Thank you for coming. To my left is Natalia Shehadeh, and she is the Chief Compliance Officer and Interim General Counsel of Weatherford, which is one of the leading oil service companies in the United States. Raj Chatterjee, who's the Chief Risk Officer at TishmanSpeyer, formerly of Morgan Stanley, and Billy Jacobson, who's a partner at Orrick and former Assistant Chief of the FCPA Fraud Section, Criminal Division. So you kind of get where we're going. Raj also is a former prosecutor, Department of Justice, and I was the former chief investigator at the World Bank doing sanctions on multilateral investments. So the title of our topic is Finding Opportunities in Managing Threats in New Emerging Markets. And we wanted to talk about there's obviously opportunity in any emerging market, so particularly one close to home, like Cuba, but there's also risks and threats of going in, whether it be the sanction issues or other regulatory issues. So I just open it up to questions, and obviously feel free to ask any questions, because we do have this distinguished panel of experts. They're quite out in the lecture circuit talking about these issues if you haven't seen them before. So Natalia, and I know Weatherford is a company that's had to navigate a lot of threats and risks in emerging markets, because you're in 100 risks in markets. So Cuba is not wide open for business. There's been some easing of it. Generally, what is the sanction scheme now that it looks like in Cuba for American companies? And at this stage of the game, what would you advise counsel companies wanting to get into Cuba under this loosened architecture?
Thanks, Glenn. I think we'd all agree it's extremely early days. We know that there has been moderate liberalization in the tourism industry, both on traveler and supporter, in the financial services sector, on the pay or payee side, in aviation with respect to the service provider and the traveler as well. But as you said, there's an enormous element, a remainder of the global industrial base that is not yet open for business. Oil and gas certainly is an interested stakeholder with respect to our industry segment on the development of Cuba, and so we are eagerly watching and waiting. And we're all anxious to talk to you about what are some of the things that we are advising our boards and our chairmans to think about as we all monitor the opening of the market.
So, and what would be the kind of things that, when you're looking to enter in the market, that it just may not occur to us right off the bat, Natalia, that you, in this lightened up regime, that companies ought to consider?
So high level, a bunch of the issues that we want to kick around. I think first and foremost, from a sanctions perspective, to put it very simply, who are you? What passport does your enterprise carry? Are you a U.S. enterprise that has seen itself subject to these regulations for umpteen years now? Are you a multinational enterprise that sees portions of your companies subject to these regulations and not others? Are you a foreign, from under a U.S. perspective, are you a foreign company that has not seen itself subject? And so you're looking at compliance with the current regulatory scheme and maybe future regulatory schemes through a little bit of a different lens. There are all of the other emerging market concepts that we want to talk about: rule of law status, how is the market going to develop with respect to what obligations is it going to impose on our companies from local content, CSR, agent requirements. How do we get in, but all of the panoply of things without being the wet blanket, both for you all and on our own industries and companies, that we want our corporations to be thinking about. Gents, help me out here.
Sure. Yeah, so Raj and Billy, and maybe Raj first. So you're thinking about going in. What do you, and from a risk assessment perspective, what are you going to do before you go in?
I mean, one of the things to think about in terms of your specific industry, and based on what Natalia just said, in terms of where you're based geographically, is are you in a type of business that's going to require boots on the ground in country, or can you conduct your business from afar? And if you're going to conduct, for most people, they may not be willing to make that commitment right off the bat, so you are conducting your business from afar. And if you have no local expertise, then one of the first tasks is to try and find local expertise, joint venture partners, consultants, et cetera, that can help you out. And that, in a place like Cuba, I think can be challenging for U.S. companies because you're dealing with countries who've been operating in Cuba that the U.S., some of whom, Venezuela, Russia, especially Russia right now, does not have the warmest of relationships. So who are those people you're going to be interacting with, who are going to serve as your consultants and your JV partners? You have to be very careful in thinking through that process.
And Billy, so if you're going to go into a JV and you're going to go do business, and 70% of the government is involved in the business, what are the concerns on a corruption side?
Yeah. So first, all of this for me falls under the rubric of risk assessment, and that's really just the white collar lawyers and the compliance lawyers' fancy way of saying know what you're doing before you do it, right? And it applies to Cuba, but it applies to every other emerging market too. So as management of a company, as a director of a company, know what you're doing. Assess the risks. What are the risks in Cuba before you go there? I think a lot of companies make the mistake of seeing a new open frontier, a new open market, and rushing in and getting themselves into a thicket of regulatory and other sorts of problematic issues without thinking through it ahead of time. So my biggest piece of advice to you all is to do a risk assessment. It can be an iterative risk assessment. It should change over time as conditions change over time. For example, with the sanctions regime being what it is today, the risk assessment is quite different from a sanctions perspective, as hopefully it will be 6 months from now, a year from now, 18 months from now. It'll change. A corruption risk assessment is one that has to be conducted to understand what are the sorts of pressures that you're going to face from a corruption perspective in Cuba. We all know there is, unfortunately, corruption in Cuba, as in many emerging markets and many modern markets like the U.S. Corruption is endemic. So what are the particular corruption pinch points in Cuba? You know, the FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, has been enforced in the last 10 years by the U.S. DOJ to an incredible degree. Hundreds of millions of dollars of fines, billions of dollars of fines all told in the last 10 years. I have every reason to expect, Raja and I were both in the section at DOJ that prosecutes FCPA, and we both agree that DOJ will be watching U.S. companies' entry into Cuba like a hawk. FCPA applies to U.S. companies, FCPA applies to U.S. persons, and non-U.S. companies who are listed on U.S. exchanges. And the DOJ and the SEC will not have any mercy on companies who rush into Cuba without thinking about the corruption risks, without doing a risk assessment, and have foot faults. They will be watching, and so a slow but steady approach to entering that market makes a ton of sense, in my opinion.
So even if the sanctions go away and it's wide open for business, we still have a little bit of the wet blanket because we have some at-home regulations like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that's going to be there in force, and that's not going away when the sanctions go down.
Oh, it's not going away at all, right? But it's a manageable wet blanket, right? These folks are in-house doing compliance work. I used to be. Now I advise as an outside counsel on compliance issues. And I think we all agree that most risks are manageable. You just have to give a lot of time and attention to them. And sometimes there are deals that can't go ahead exactly as you'd want them to, but you can change them a little bit around the margins and still get the material effect that you want. So as long as we think about the issues, and we'll talk in detail about some of them today, as long as you think about the issues, you're probably going to be able to protect yourself.
Yeah. Right, so Natalia, you're going in, you're JVing up, or you're going to have representatives. What are from a corruption perspective, what are the things that you're going to be concerned about? And like if you're going to go into Cuba, and Raj and Billy jump in here, how do you protect yourself? You want to go in, you want to use one of these vehicles, JV, or you can do maybe buy something or use distributors or whatever. How do you insulate yourself from what you call they're going to be watching you like a hawk, right?
I think it's easy to use the two buzzwords, due diligence, right? I think first and foremost, though, As Billy said, if you're a company that has an existing compliance program that you can leverage for purposes of thinking about getting into the emerging market, to be able to assess the risk that Glenn is highlighting, what is the local regime going to require of us for purposes of getting in? So preference may be not innately to form a joint venture unless the local law obligates me to partner with someone, unless the local law says you have to be a local company. So sort of back to that passport jurisdictional question, who are we? Yes, we're going into Cuba, but are we going to be Cuban? Are we going to be locally registered, locally domiciled company? And if not, then down the path of the question you're asking, I'm getting married to someone, and we're going to walk down the aisle together. And how long is this marriage going to last? How strong is the diligence that we're going to do of one another? So
it would make a cute couple.
I want to make sure that it's a lasting marriage, especially in an emerging market like this where we're going to be faced with any number of challenges. So what? Most good compliance programs today do some level of, from zero to scorch the earth, assessment of my marital partner, right, my joint venture partner. Whether it's full up joint venture partner or it's a promotional sales agent, some kind of commission-based agent, distributor, or some kind of, what type of party are we talking here? Intermediaries, agents, people who are repping your enterprise's face before the government. And at the end of the day, you just need to be comfortable that they will represent you with the same level of integrity and level of expectation of practice and execution that you would expect of all of your employees based on how you run your business today.
And a related issue is to think about the countries and the companies that were able to get into the Cuban market before the U.S., right? So who is it in big time? The big time players are Russia, China, and Venezuela. Unfortunately, countries, again, with not the greatest anti-corruption histories. So what have the companies that have entered the Cuban market already, what sort of precedent have they set in the market that perhaps people in Cuban government and other Cuban business people are sort of expecting maybe when the Americans come, they will have the same sort of business practices, right? Hate to stereotype, but we know it happens. We see all over the world, Russians, Chinese, Venezuelans acting all over the world. And it's a problem for U.S. companies who do have to play by a different set of rules. So whether Americans are partnering with local Cuban firms or partnering with the Russians, the Chinese, the Venezuelans, or whomever else, what Natalia said about this due diligence and making sure you really understand who you're doing business with is crucial.
And this idea of the present status of the landscape with this existing foreign investment from stakeholder countries that may not be in the greatest partnership stead with the United States, sort of back to the pendulum swing on the sanction side, presents an additional avenue of due diligence obligation with respect to, look, as Raj said, we have a sanctions landscape right now with Russia. So are we going to be entering the market with parties that may already be subject to the long arm of the United States from an existing sanctions regime outside of the Cuba program? So barriers up, and it's happy to go in Cuba, but could there be other tentacle effects under a sanctions landscape because of foreign investment from Venezuela and from Russia and potentially other state actors that remain subject to other sanctions programs?
So Raj, you're going to go into let's say business is opened up, the sanctions are gone. What are the headline threats that you're going to be concerned about as you enter the market? What are those top? Your board's asking you, this is what you do. What do we need to know?
So whenever you have a historic situation like the one we have with Cuba, and it could be in another country, another part of the world, there's a change in administration, people are very excited, and business folks love talking about first mover advantage. It is people like us who bring up the kind of unpopular notion of first mover disadvantage. So you have to be a little deliberate and considered in making that approach. Because the old adage of you only get one chance to make a great impression is you're worse off if you go rush in there and mess things up and trip over wires rather than if you would have given up maybe a little bit of the upside, see the mistakes that others have made before you, or just study the situation a little bit in greater detail before going in. So I would first advise my board, my chairperson, my CEO, to take a look and see how others have fared in our industry, to hopefully learn from lessons that we have experienced in entering other markets and apply those to Cuba. And so much of it is the people who you're working with. I can't emphasize that enough in terms of your success or failure depends in large measure on most U.S. companies do not have a existing relationship with people on the ground in Cuba. So you're going to have to establish a relationship for the first time. And in order to do that, I think that the word due diligence, which is a very broad term, but you really have to get comfortable in getting into bed with somebody and not just jump at the first person out there. And given the size of Cuba, I think the number of people who are credible business partners is probably fairly limited at this point in time. So everybody's going to rush to, to get married, to use your phrase, to the same group of people, and then are you left with the B team? And
right.
You really don't want to be with the B team. So those are some of the initial issues, and the way I'd frame it is to take a considered approach and not just jump in because everybody else is jumping in.
And Billy, when going into markets from an FCPA perspective, when you look at the landscape of enforcement actions, by far the majority of those enforcement actions have involved the misbehavior, not necessarily of the company, but of the company's partner, counterparty, joint venture partner. Is that a fair?
Yeah, absolutely. So anyone working on your behalf in front of any sort of government agency is the type of person you've got to do due diligence on, like Natalia explained. So that would be your sales agents if they're selling to state-owned entities, right? And keep in mind, as you all know, that 80% of Cuban business is state-owned. Analogous situation to China. And U.S. and Western companies have gotten themselves tripped up in China a tremendous amount of FCPA enforcement around Western companies operating in China because they're selling to state-owned entities, and every employee of a state-owned entity, whether they're the chairman or the janitor, is a government official under the FCPA, and so any sort of illicit payment made to them is a violation of the statute. The same will apply in Cuba. So that's one area to look out for. And it's your third parties you have to do the diligence. Customs brokers is another area rife with corruption problems in many or most developing countries. So you'll all need customs brokers in Cuba. Do due diligence on your customs brokers. Make sure you know who's clearing customs for you and that you can trust them. You'll need work visas probably. Who are you going to hire to procure your work visas? You're going to need probably a local party, a local third party. And there's lots of corruption in lots of countries of the world in terms of visa processors. We see it all the time, the four of us, unfortunately. So those are three categories, at least, of third parties that this diligence has to be done on. And not only do the diligence, but maintain the relationship and monitor the relationship. So don't just do your diligence before you hire them and never talk to them again for 10 years, letting them do their business on behalf of your company. Stay in close contact with them. Understand how they're going about doing their business on your behalf so that you can assure yourself that there's nothing untoward going on.
And so in the area of multilateral development banks, and the banks, maybe this one for you, Billy, and I'll comment on this initially, is coming from previously from the multilateral, the World Bank. When the multilaterals go in and they start giving money for non-defense article-related infrastructure and health and agricultural sector, and then big money comes in from these multilateral development banks, and companies from around the world are bidding on these projects. Even though these aren't American companies, there's a new regulator in town when the multilaterals are in, because the multilateral development banks have very, very powerful investigative bodies that have audit rights and the ability to acquire information that's tied to their financing. And they can make criminal referrals, they can sanction. In some cases, companies are more worried about being debarred by a multilateral because then they're out of the market. So this regime applies to even non-Americans. Whoever gets the financing is subject to this oversight. So if you're thinking of going in, and the multilaterals go in, and what we're referring to is the World Bank, Latin Division, the Vice Presidency, or the Inter-American Development Bank, which also would be focused in the Caribbean region. What do you say to those companies? What kind of program, how do you insulate yourself from the risks of those very large investigative functions?
Yeah, well, you framed your question in the form of an answer,
Yeah.
right? So, or vice versa.
Sorry.
So that's all right. I mean, Glenn's question highlights another risk. It's not just the U.S. regulators, but it's the multilateral development bank who are increasingly becoming akin to regulators and have their sanctions have enormous consequences for companies. I mean, it can put them out of business entirely if they're dependent upon funding from these banks. So the good news is the same sort of compliance program that will insulate you from liability from the U.S. regulators will also, to the large degree, insulate you from liability with regard to the sanctions boards of the banks.
I want to just add to that. So sometimes there are companies and people at companies who take a lot of comfort saying, hey, the IFC or the Inter-American Development Bank is investing here, so they must have done their diligence, so we'll just kind of ride their coattails, and we kind of have a pseudo-quasi-multilateral bank development cover.
Right.
But
they're financing the project and the
yes, and their mission is in those countries.
Right.
But a Western company, you can invest anywhere you want. And so the government will not give you, the DOJ and the SEC will not give you any latitude just because you depended on the diligence done by the multilateral development banks. So it is not a cover that you're investing alongside them. You can be prosecuted, correct me if I'm wrong, Glenn, but the World Bank is a sovereign. It's not subject to the FCPA.
Right.
So it has essentially immunity, and you're out there hanging out by your own, and you don't have that cover that you think you do. So a lot of people mistake that development bank as a cover, and they must have done their diligence.
I think that's right, and they also find themselves shocked and surprised when the investigators from these institutions show up with this little letter, and they're saying, we want to execute our audit rights on you and see how you use the money that we gave you. And now that audit right looks, feels, and smells like a subpoena. Mm-hmm. And little do they know that once the bank gets done with it, it goes to the host like the bank then refers it to the member government that has jurisdiction. So it could go to the United States, it could go to Brazil, it could go to the UK, where the company comes from.
And Raj's point applies equally to the U.S. government. In other words, just because the U.S. government, whether it's the Department of Commerce or otherwise, or the Department of State, is pushing you into Cuba or encouraging U.S. business investment into Cuba, that doesn't mean you get a get-out-of-jail-free card if you misstep there. Not at all. In fact, when I was in-house, one of the few deals we actually put the kibosh on was one that was being pushed by the U.S. government, by a branch of the U.S. government. But they were pushing it, but we thought it was too risky from a number of different perspectives, so we didn't pursue it. So there is no sort of immunity just because either a bank or the U.S. government even is pushing you in.
And that second part really bears emphasizing, because that's what it's exactly what you're going to have here. You're going to have multiple branches of the U.S. government pushing U.S. commercial interests, whether it be Cuba or any other country that is emerging. And business folks tend to say, hey, this has the stamp of approval of the U.S. government.
Yeah, let's go.
I met these guys from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce who introduced me to whoever. But if you have an issue, that doesn't get you very far.
Okay.
It gets you further if you hadn't done that.
Let's try to take the wet blanket off.
Isn't everyone here to talk about opportunity in Cuba? Okay. So how do we turn this around so that you don't go home with everyone's blood pressure elevated?
Yeah, we all do business in risky markets.
We all do business in risky markets. It's still about opportunity. It's still about seizing the opportunity. So all of us here as part of the compliance professional bar globally, what's the opportunity nonetheless staying in the good graces of your compliance programs and so forth? Take this to your leadership that getting it right on entry is how you seize the competitive advantage. If you have a compliance program in place today, leverage it for purposes arm in arm with the rest of your organization of assessing how are we going to go in, how are we going to do it the right way, how are we going to make more money and capitalize on greater market share because we went in the right way. There's all manner of opportunity, I think, that's not being seized. Look, there are not that many emerging markets left on the planet nowadays. Right. So instead of maybe worrying, we want all of our companies to be mindful of the risks, but think about seizing doing it the right way as an opportunity to posture your company with the government about you being a safe investment, you being a safe local partner, you being the right partner in your industry segment because you know how to do business the right way. You are going to bring non-corrupt business practices. You're going to bring safe business, sound business to Cuba. I think there's great opportunity for the compliance elements of all of the industries to start talking and posturing all of these prophylactics, all of these things that we want to keep our company safe in a competitively advantaged way.
You could leverage this
Absolutely.
for competitive advantage. And I'm, again, trying to remove the blanket, the business goes on in these very high-risk markets. So if you could, I know, and time is going short, if Billy, Raj, Natalia, if you could just give a couple of 2 or 3 minutes of advice on what high-level things you would do as you prepare into that market.
Well, hopefully you've got your standard compliance program, right? So you're running that. It's got due diligence, as we discussed. You've got controls around your cash, right? So cash isn't going out the door in a way that you can't control or anticipate. You've got controls around payments to government officials for things like travel, excessive entertainment. Those are the sorts of relatively petty things that get companies in trouble in the first instance. So you want to just make sure that you've got your good international business compliance program and it operates in Cuba. And again, like I said earlier, you do that risk assessment, you understand what you're getting yourself into before you're there. I agree with Natalia's point. And I prefaced my remarks with it earlier. This is very manageable stuff. We manage it in 170 countries around the world. It's very manageable, but it has to be managed. The place companies will trip up is if they just rush in without thinking about how to manage it.
People at your respective companies who have roles similar to ours, we're paid to do the worrying. That's why the first half, we're the worry warts at your company.
Who invited you to the boardroom?
Exactly. I think one of the things I look at and we look at in the companies that I've been at is in terms of whether you think this is a quick hit and you can make money in a short period of time or whether this is a longer term proposition and what that means economically in terms of resources and how much you're willing to dedicate to this venture, and if you're willing to break even at best or lose money in the short term in order for that longer term reward. And because if you go in and just economically you do not you misjudge the market and you pull out, it's a lot harder to re-enter that market because you've burned yourself, and it's going to be a fairly it's going to be a small market, not in terms of economic numbers, but in people knowing the players. So I think strategically to think through that is one of the things that we would be discussing.
Good strategic plan.
That's right, and be very blunt with yourself in terms of years 1, 2, and 3 we might lose, years 4 and 5 we might break even, and after that we might be good.
I think I would also add, companies often have very short-term memories, and governments often have very long memories. So for anyone, hypothetically, in the room who may have had business or a presence in Cuba many, many, many years ago, make sure your leadership and your enterprise assesses what could be skeletons from the past that could come to fruition or rear their head again as maybe your new chairman or your new leadership who's just a couple of years with the company and wasn't with the enterprise way back then is so anxious to go meet the minister of X department without recognizing maybe you fled the country. Maybe you left people unemployed previously in the country. Maybe you left debts in the country. So I think being mindful to the extent any of your enterprises or your clients have history is think about whether that history is relevant to an entry or a re-entry into Cuba or any other emerging market.
All right, so they're waving at me on the sides over here. I just want to, the last couple of minutes, open it up to any questions anyone has. There's one right there. Sir?
I'm Jay Berkman with Crowley Maritime, and I think the panel has been extraordinary. I just wanted to share one thing that you all talked about. We've been doing business in Cuba for 14 years. We have never paid any sort of a bribe of any sort, and we've never been requested one. Now, I'm not naive about that, but I wanted to share that experience. And then three things that you touched in relation to corruption. We've not had that problem, and I absolutely agree. If you go in right from the beginning, it makes everything else easier. You just may not get what you want, but you don't get what you don't want. Secondly, in relation to visas, it's very easy. You go to the Cuban intersection in Washington, you pay them $70, you get your visa, or they tell you they don't want to give you one. But there's not some other negotiation that goes on within the visas. The third thing, in relation to the customs brokers, they have approximately 4 to 5 established customs brokers, which may, well, in fact, all of them have state ownership. They have fixed tariffs. You pay them what's in their tariff, and they do the job you need to get done. So I think it goes, they do have a structure to try to avoid corruption. The Cuban government is not doing anything to promote corruption, and it goes back to go in the right way with the right product, I think.
Yeah, you know, I'd love to. That's great to hear. I've heard the opposite story from many other companies, unfortunately, about some of the same things, including the customs brokers. So it's just hard to know exactly, right? Different contexts, different agencies, perhaps.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Arturo Villar with Hispanic Market Weekly and Hispanic Market Works. And my question is, if anybody here, and I imagine most of the people here, would want to get information in general about the opportunities and how they develop, where can they go? Do you have ideas of any publications that are really looking into how to do business in Cuba? Not with the flag, lift the embargo or anything like that. Just simply informing on the opportunities to do business in Cuba. Can you tell us if you know of any publications that could give us that kind of information?
Well, yeah, I think that you're going to see the legal community, the consulting community, and I can't give you a list, but as Cuba, as this whole industry shifts, being from the biggest consulting firm in the world, that demand comes from clients and the need to generate that type of information. So you're going to see, I would suspect, in very near terms, I know that we have a Cuba working group, the chairs, one of them sitting over there and the other's in the back of the room, and those types of things, country reports, opportunity reports, assessment reports, all of that will be springing forth from the consulting, the legal community, business development consulting firms, whereas before they didn't have the legal standing to do it, they didn't have any incentive to do it, at least in the United States. Now, I suspect you're going to see a wrath of that. And I would say just be patient, because I know how these firms work, and they will come.
So to the gentleman, we will all be getting a book that the Wharton School has published later on via email on opportunities in Cuba with the bibliography as well.
Any other questions? I saw there was one. Yes, sir. 2 questions. Questions.
My name is Antonio Martinez. To the gentleman's point, go to Cuba and you'll see the opportunities that are there. It's not in the book. It's actually going there and seeing it for yourself. Now, I was in Havana 3 weeks ago, and the most encouraging thing that I got from that was a Cuban cuenta propista who has a business there, a very successful one. He's not the only one. There's a number of successful businesses. Wanted to hire me to do legal work for him here in the United States because he's looking forward to the day of having investors from the U.S. or even having a branch of his business in the United States. And I had to explain to him about the limitations of the embargo and that kind of thing. I was very encouraged and heartened by that exchange. So the best way to do it is to go.
Oh, I do. I go.
Okay. Go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. One more question. I got the hook from the corner room here. One more, please. Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm Mario Baez again. When you go to Cuba, because basically everything works through Cuban government-owned entities. Now they're mostly headed by generals. And you'll find a whole generation of retired generals, retired colonels, et cetera, who are trying to scrape out a living because actually they don't have Social Security. So these are the people that approach you to be consultants, to be of help. And that is a whole sort of milieu that has happened in Cuba. And how do foreign companies deal with that and trying to use them as the available agents really to help you?
Yeah, this is exactly the sort of problem we see in emerging markets all over the world, in Africa, other places in Latin America, Asia. If they are former government officials, you're in a much safer place than if they are current government officials. If they are current government officials, but they're moonlighting as consultants, you've got a big problem because you would almost have to disprove that they're not using their official influence to help you, which would be corruption. Foreign officials, I think what we'll probably see as that market opens up and matures, you'll probably see a lot of former government officials, just like we have in the U.S. We have former congressmen, et cetera, serving as lobbyists and so forth. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you do your due diligence so you know who you're partnering with.
Okay. Well, thank you all. We have one more. Can we ask one more? One more. Quickly.
But there was some comment earlier from John McIntyre about the fiscal regime. And is it really an opportunity if the fiscal regime assumes the business has a 60% operating margin?
Businessman Raj?
I'm not sure I understand.
Can you restate the question?
Sorry, we keep talking about the opportunity when the sanctions are lifted.
Right.
But is it still an opportunity under the current tax regime, the fiscal regime?
Right. So that's another part of the risk assessment, right? In determining what the tax structure is going to do to your profits, how you're going to capitalize your project, or how are you going to recognize your gains, where are you going to recognize them?
That's going to be industry specific, right? What is your risk tolerance for your profit? But it needs to be part of everything that we're talking about, the diligence on the front end. I think there was a very anxious man in the back who wanted to ask a question, who I think had a mic.
Natalia.
Sorry.
Ben's going to hook me.
You've been demiked. Sorry.
It's good, though, that they're asking a lot of questions. It's good. We did our job.
Hi, my name is Rodney Newton from DSSP.
One question.
And D-Mike, really? Hello?
Yep.
All right, here we go. My name is Rodney Newton from DSSP Consulting. Two quick questions. I think the gentleman over here might have addressed it. For small companies, my first question was kind of, how do you find out about opportunities in Cuba? And I think the answer probably is go to Cuba. Second, from a risk and compliance standpoint, for smaller companies who might not have a compliance department or who might not be very experienced in that area, what advice does the panel have for doing business in Cuba and trying to protect yourself as a smaller company where you might not have the resources to, as a larger company, to kind of have a compliance?
I think you'd be surprised about the power of one. It only takes one person with the right message to look at your government counterpart or your government client in the eye and say, this is how my company of 1, 2, or 5 does business. We do so ethically. We will only engage partners who will stand for the same ethos that we do. It doesn't take legions. If you can get that strength of message from the person who's going to be the first boot on the ground in the country or doing the outreach.
And from a corruption perspective, the DOJ and the SEC put out an FCPA resource guide a few years ago. And they did so mostly thinking about small and medium-sized companies who didn't want to hire big law firms to tell them what the components of a compliance program are. So if you do nothing else, download that free from the DOJ website online and see what the government's expecting.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.